Well, good morning. Welcome to Parkway. How's everybody doing? Good. It's a good morning to be here. I mean, I don't know if I've ever heard that much screaming and yelling in here before. So it's awesome. I love the energy of our students. If you are standing in the back still, there are some more seats a little bit down here, some more over here where we had people sitting for baptism. So we do have a few more seats up here if you're looking, and a few more up here. So please, hopefully you can find a seat. So sorry it's so crowded, but hey, that's a good problem to have at church, right? So amen to that. All right, so as we get into it today, this is week 4 of our series At the Cross, and we've been looking at different people that we know were at the cross, and today we get the honor of looking at Mary, the mother of Jesus. But before we get into it, I want to talk about a statement that you've probably heard before. You've probably heard the statement, no parent should ever have to bury their child. When you hear that statement, you probably know people in your life that have had to do that. Maybe you've had to do that. And while that statement is very true, the reality is sometimes it happens. I know for our family, we had that experience back in 2013. Our family was living in Uganda, and while we were there, my wife was pregnant with our 4th child. We had our oldest son, our 2 daughters, and we were excited to welcome Truett, a new baby boy, into the world. She went into labor just as she should, about 4 or 5 days early, and everything went well. The delivery went well. Everything was as smooth as a delivery could go. But when Truett came into the world, I can still remember him moving and his arms moving. I even remember one of his eyes kind of cracking open just a little bit, and he was fighting to take that first breath. And just like every parent that's in the room in that moment is excited to hear their child cry for the first time, because that's a sign that breath and air has entered their lungs for the first time. You're longing for that moment, but for Truett, it just didn't come. Well, quickly, the doctor and the nurse that was there, they began working on him, trying to clear his airways like they normally would, and that wasn't working. They began to put a tube down his throat to try to fill his lungs, and that also didn't work. So over the next 45 minutes, they fought for his life as we cried out to God, asking him to heal our son. We didn't know what was wrong. But for whatever reason, he just simply was not able to breathe. And after about 45 minutes, we had to submit and allow him to go. And I remember that moment. I remember asking why. I remember the confusion. We'd moved our family to Uganda to share the message of hope of Jesus Christ, and after doing something like that, surely God could make our child breathe. But in that moment, he chose not to. And there's so much that I could share about what we've learned through that. But one of the things I remember that was so hard in the middle of it all was watching my wife and being concerned about her, worrying about her, because there's a bond that a mother has with a child that goes beyond what a man can understand, because this child grows in their womb. They long for the day to hold this child in their arms. They long for the day to raise them, to bond with them in a unique way that only moms can. And Shauna never got to do that with Truett. And it makes me think about Mary. It makes me think about Mary, the mother of Jesus, and what she experienced that day at the cross. It's hard to imagine watching your son suffer the way that Jesus suffered. You know, we've gone into the intimate details of his suffering over the last several weeks. And when you think back to those weeks and you think back to what he experienced, to be there at the foot of the cross and watch all that, it's heart-wrenching. I'm sure she was confused. I'm sure she was wondering, why did it have to be done this way? And I think today, for us to better understand what we can learn from Mary and what she experienced at the cross, I think we need to go back and look at some things that we know took place in Jesus' adult life and his interactions with Mary. Actually, the Gospel of John is very intentional about 2 times in particular where Jesus and Mary were interacting in his adult life. He's very intentional about that, and one of them is at the cross, but one of them happens early, very early in his adult life and his ministry. And so let's turn there. If you have your Bibles, open up to John chapter 2. We'll be in verse 1, or you can follow along right there in your message notes. Here's what it says. It says, "On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come.' His mother said to the servants, 'Do whatever he tells you.'" You can kind of imagine this scene, right? Like, you can imagine, while this is the first recorded miracle of turning water to wine that we know that Jesus did, it's obvious Mary knew and had experienced some pretty cool stuff in Jesus' earlier years, to the point that she kind of wants to show him off, I think, a little bit here. I mean, what parent doesn't like to brag about their kid? And then, I mean, the bragging could be endless if your son's Jesus Christ, right? Like, you could remember this one day when we were at home, this thing fell and he caught it in midair and he fixed it and then he put it back on the shelf without even touching it. It was amazing. We don't know if that happened, but you know, you could only imagine all the things as Jesus starts to recognize the miraculous powers he has at his fingertips. And in this moment, Mary is like, "Look, these people need some help and I know you can fix it, so fix it." And Jesus is like, "Woman, my hour has not yet come." And there's some interesting words here. First of all, John doesn't call her Mary. That seems a bit confusing to me. Like, why doesn't John call her Mary? We all know her name's Mary. And why does he just call her the mother of Jesus? We're not really sure, but one thing we are sure is that John wanted us to know in this instance that Mary was there and that she was the mother of Jesus. He mentions it 3 different times in this short little passage. The other interesting thing is that Jesus says woman instead of mother. Now, the Greek word for woman right here is actually not a disrespectful term, because it would almost kind of seem like Jesus is being a little disrespectful. It was an honoring term for women in general at that time. But I think Jesus was intentional about saying woman instead of saying mom in this moment. To understand that, we have to look at the words, "My hour has not yet come." You see, in this moment, Jesus recognizes that if he does this could be the start of events that take place that leads him to the hour that maybe his mom doesn't realize he's going to step into and walk through. And Jesus is in control of the situation. And I think in this moment, you can imagine the interaction. Any parents in the room, or maybe as a child, maybe you've done this to your parents. Your parents have asked you to do something, and you're not real fired up to do it. And so instead of saying mom or dad, you call them by their first name. Ever done that? I can remember doing it. I can remember when my own kids do that. And while it is somewhat respectful because it is your name, they are pushing back a little bit saying, "Hey, I don't really want to do that right now." And I think in this moment, Jesus is trying to help Mary understand, my time has not yet come. My hour is not here. And you don't understand. You want people to see how awesome it is that your son can do these things. But there's bigger things at stake when I do this. And so, it's interesting to look at these things. But you see, the interesting part is that John is also foreshadowing moments that we will see that take place at the cross. Some of the very language that you see right here, we're going to look at again here in a few moments. And outside of this particular story of the water to wine, and then over here in John 19, where we'll be in a moment at the cross, we don't see John mention any other event that took place in Jesus' adult life where he and his mom were there. Now, interestingly enough, though, while this is a unique thing for John and the Gospel of John, I think what he is trying to do is trying to highlight some interesting and unique things about Mary, which will be important for us to recognize when she's at the cross, because Mary has a perspective that no one else has at the cross. You see, some of the things that are interesting about Mary is Mary was Jesus' mom. No one else was Jesus' mom while he was on this earth, right? Except Mary. And the intimate moments that Mary had with her son, with Jesus as a baby, with Jesus when they went to dedicate him at the temple, with Jesus as he grew, it was a unique relationship that she had with Jesus that no one else could have. And she brings that unique perspective to the foot of the cross. Also, Mary was a wife. We know that Mary was a wife because the Gospel of Luke tells us that she was married to Joseph. We also know that they had other children after Jesus. But the interesting thing is somewhere along the way, Joseph passes away. We don't know exactly what happened, but we just know he's gone. And so now Mary is not only a wife, now she's a widow. And in that culture, the role of the oldest child, the oldest son, would be to care for his mom. So she brings this perspective to the cross as well. And finally, we know that Mary also became a follower of Jesus. You know, I think some of this really began to dawn on her when she and Joseph were actually looking for Jesus when he was 12 years old. You remember that scene? They're in Jerusalem, and then they're heading back home. And we talked about last week, Jerusalem's some 90 miles away from where they live, so it's about a week's journey by foot to get there. And while they're on the way going back, they're like, wait a second, you seen Jesus? I haven't seen Jesus. Anybody seen Jesus? I don't know where he is. So they go back to Jerusalem. And where do they find him after 3 days? At the temple. And the leaders and the religious leaders and the teachers of the law are amazed by the questions Jesus is asking. My guess is he's asking questions about some of the prophecies that maybe they hadn't yet put together that were pointing to him. And I think in that moment, Mary began to realize how significant this was, that angel said, will you carry the Son of God? And so it's interesting to look at her perspective. And then she goes to the wedding and at Cana, and she sees this opportunity, this couple that was vulnerable because they'd run out of wine, and she's like, hey, I need you to fix their problem. And I think in that moment when Jesus is saying, my hour has not yet come, when she's at the cross, she's thinking back to this time. The other interesting thing is I think over Jesus' ministry on earth, Mary begins to get it a little bit more. And she sees the future of what's going to happen. And we have this scene that the other three Gospels actually talk about, that John doesn't mention. And it's this moment where Jesus has just healed a man on the Sabbath in a synagogue. And it says that the Pharisees looked for an opportunity to kill him from that point forward. And I think word had gotten out. It had gotten out to Mary, a concerned mother, and her own biological kids that were outside of Jesus. And they knew that if Jesus' ministry keeps going the way it's going to end in his death. And so they come, and there's a crowd around Jesus, and they can't get to him. And they get word to Jesus that says, hey, your mother and your brothers are here. And I think the reason that they came there was because they were starting to realize that his hour was going to come. They wanted to talk to him and be like, look, can you just heal people not on the Sabbath anymore? Like, can you change the way you're doing this? Because it's not going to end well. But Jesus knew he was submitting to the Father, and his hour would eventually come. He had a plan. And so while we look at this and we think about Mary, let's go to the cross and look at this mother, the wife that became a widow and a disciple. John chapter 19, verse 24 is where we'll pick up. It says, so the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciples whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. When you look at this and you see the words there, they're eerily similar, right? You see the word woman. You see how, again, we don't call her Mary. It's the mother of Jesus. And you see that word hour as well. And so one of the things that I believe that John is wanting us to catch, because John just records these two events with Jesus and his mom in his adult life, is that I think he wants us to compare some of these things. I think he wants us to look back at John 2 and you look at 19 and see what we can learn from it. And so what can I learn from the experience of Jesus' mother at the cross? The first fill-in, if you're following along there, is this. My choices make me stand out. My choices make me stand out. We go back to Jesus and Mary in John chapter 2. The choice to get Jesus to change the water to wine was going to cause Jesus to stand out. In that moment, Jesus had a decision to make. Am I going to rescue this couple in their shame and set a course of events underway that's going to lead to my eventual death on the cross? Or am I going to pause a little longer? And while he, I think, wanted to wait a little longer, there was an element of submitting to his mom, but also submitting to his Father in heaven and saying, okay, Lord, here we go. And Mary wants Jesus to stand out in that moment. I think that's part of her desire. But if she could go back and do it over again, she might have delayed that moment as well. But we fast forward to John 19, and Mary remembers Jesus saying, my hour has not yet come. And in John 19, verse 24, it says, we read it a moment ago, so the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother. You see, now Mary is making a choice to stand out. She's making a choice to be there. She's there at the foot of the cross, and while we contrast, the soldiers are also there. We talked about a few weeks ago, they didn't have a choice, and now they're gambling over Jesus' clothes, but Mary is there because she chose to be there. She chose to step into the hardest moment of her life and watch her son suffer and die. She chose to be there not only because of that, but because she was also a follower of Jesus. When we think about her stepping into that most difficult moment, and we contrast it also with the other followers, where's Peter? Where's those guys that said, we're with you all the way to the end? And Jesus says, Peter, you're going to disown me before the sun comes up 3 times. But Mary chose to be there. She made the choice to stand out. And I think in that moment, there's some things that we need to learn about the choices that we make that cause us to stand out. You see, as a Christ follower, we're called to be in the world, but not of the world. We're supposed to stand out. We're not supposed to stand out and pointing the finger and judging others. We're supposed to stand out because the unconditional love we share with the people around us. And for you, that might even be simple things, like at home, when you're with your family, setting that phone aside so it's not a distraction when you get home from work, so that you can be intentional and be present with your family. Maybe that's one of the ways that you need to stand out. Maybe for you, another way you need to stand out is that you know you've got to deal with some stuff from your past. It's hindering your marriage, it's hindering the way you're parenting, and honestly, it's hindering your relationships at work and beyond. You know, one of the wisest advice I heard a guy teaching about how to parent well, he said, look, if you don't learn to deal with your own stuff, you're not going to be able to guide your children the way that you actually desire. And so maybe the way that you need to stand out is you need to submit and recognize that you need counseling. And that feels maybe humiliating, but the reality is you need to face some of that stuff and you need to deal with it so that you can be the best that you can be, so you can be the best for your family, for your friends, for your coworkers. And maybe, just maybe, you're going to then know how to help someone else. And in that moment, you're going to stand out because you're going to share the testimony of what God did when you chose to deal with the stuff that's been holding you back. So I don't know what it is for you. I don't know what choices you need to make, but the choices we make, they do define us. And our choices as Christ followers should be kingdom-focused solely. It was the way that Jesus lived his life 100% of the time that he walked on this earth. And that leads us to our second point. Our second point is this, that our concern should always be for others. Our concern should always be for others. Look at John 19, 26 through 27 again. It says, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple, whom he loved, standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. Now, let's look at those words again that we looked at earlier. Now, I don't know why in the moment that he said, "Woman," for me, if there's ever a time for Jesus to say "mom," it would have been this moment. Hanging there on the cross, dying, about to breathe his last. Maybe be a little bit more intimate, Jesus, and say "mom" in this moment instead of "woman." But you see, I think what Jesus was doing was very intentional. He needed to separate himself from her in this moment and help her recognize that the way he was going to care for her, his concern for her in that moment, was connecting her with John and connecting John with her in this way. Son and mom. I think the other thing that Jesus wanted Mary to recognize in that moment was the fact that she needed to remember he was there from the creation of the world. He was there when she was knit together in her mother's womb. And by the grace of God, he chose to use her as a vessel to bring his son into the world. But her time and her hour had now come. Her job and her task was now also coming to an end as a mother of the Son of God. And now she still needed that earthly care. And in that moment, Jesus is hanging on the cross. He's still concerned for his mom. And he says, "Look, I know you're a widow. I know it's my responsibility as the oldest son to care for you. And there's no better person to care for you than my best friend, John." And that's what God's asking us to do. It said that very hour, there's immediacy in the care that Mary receives, that Jesus set up. And when you look back at Jesus' life, there was immediacy when he cared for people. He would be on his way to another town to share the message of hope, and along the way, he would get interrupted. But he always stopped, and he immediately dealt with the people that needed help in that moment. You know, when I think about us in life and the things that we wrestle with and the distractions that come as Christ followers, the thing that I've learned is that interruptions rarely come at a convenient time, right? Like when you're on your way to that work meeting that you've been preparing for the last 3 months, and on the way there, you get a flat tire, or you notice somebody else has a flat tire, and you feel that tug, and you're like, do I turn the car back around and go back and help them, or do I go to work and feel guilty about it the rest of the day? Jesus would turn the car around. What do? Do we help people in that moment? And what about you get to work, you've got that meeting, and a coworker comes in, and you've been prepared for it, and you're ready, it's starting in a few minutes, and they come in, and their life is in shambles, and you really don't have time to deal with it. What would Jesus do? The loving thing is to sit and be present, to somehow put aside that meeting that you've prepared for and be present with the thing that's going on in their life. Because if you rush past it, that person just had an opportunity to interact with the love of Christ through you. And if we're not immediate in the way that we respond to these things, if you're like, oh, I'll get to it later, we'll have to talk about this later in the day or tomorrow or whatever, you'll probably forget, you'll probably become distracted, and you probably won't ever allow them to experience the love of Christ in that moment. I know it's not always possible to do it immediately, but man, when we can, that's when you see true transformation take place in people's lives. And so, if we're going to have concern for others the way Jesus had concern, we've got to follow his example. And his example comes to culmination at the very end when we look at John 19, verse 30. When it says, he said, it's finished. And he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. You see, this whole 4 weeks, we've been talking about all this. We've been talking about the fact that these people were at the cross. We learned from their experience and their perspective, but the reality is, in the very end of it all, this was the moment. This hour had come. It's finished. What's finished? Jesus sacrificing his life, the perfect life lived for you and me. The perfect sacrifice for the criminals that hung beside him. The perfect sacrifice for the Roman soldiers that were there that had abused him when he says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. The perfect sacrifice that he gave his life for Mary Magdalene. As we looked at her confusion in that moment and her clarity at the resurrection. The perfect sacrifice for his own mom, who probably began to understand that this day was going to come, as hard as it was. And so when you think about Jesus, here's the thing that we need to remember. While our concern should always be for others, Jesus' concern has always been about you. Right? Jesus' concern has always, he went to the cross for you. He went to the cross for me. He went to the cross for all those we've talked about the past few weeks because he first loved us. We can't earn it. We can't be good enough to deserve it. We just simply have to accept it. And so if you're ready to accept it, if you've never accepted the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, the best part about the sacrifice is that wasn't it. We know in Genesis chapter 3, sin entered the world. It separated God from man. And God told Adam and Eve, if you sin, if you eat from that tree, you will die. Death entered the world. That death is an eternal separation from God. But the rest of this book, we talk about it all the time, was about God running after us and trying to bring us back into relationship with him. And ultimately, it culminated at the cross. But he conquered death 3 days later for you and for me, for all those that were at the cross as well. And when we submit and give our lives over to him, we have a hope of a relationship that can begin now, just like John and Mary's relationship began in that hour. But that relationship goes for eternity. So if you're ready, would you pray the prayer that's on the back of your message notes while I pray and close for us all? God, thank you. God, thank you for Mary. God, thank you for choosing her to carry your son. God, thank you for the things that we've learned from her. God, we know that there was nothing perfect about Mary. She just simply was a humble servant that you saw and said, I can use her. God, can you use us? Would you use us? God, we want to live our lives as Jesus lived his, concerned for others. God, we thank you for those moments where you've put people in our lives that had concern for us. We thank you for the immediacy of ways that we've been cared for, and God, I pray that you would help us to do the same so that people out there, the people that leave these doors, when we leave these doors, the people out there in this community, they could experience the love of Christ through us. God, I pray for these counselors that are here for Pine Cove. There's students going to be kids pouring into this room tomorrow, and they have been going through all kinds of stuff. Some of them are doing really well. Others are really struggling. God, help them. Help them to meet those kids right where they're at. Help those kids to experience the love of Christ this week. God, we love you. We thank you for Jesus because we don't deserve it, but man, we will accept it. It's in his name we pray. Amen.